By the silent Nile, where the waters reflect the Egyptian sky like a mirror tinged with gold, history is not merely inscriptions in stone. It is sighs carried away by the wind, dreams never fulfilled, the last glance of a woman who knew she would never be rewritten with justice. Cleopatra VII Philopator. That name has long been obscured by the red streaks of power and desire. But she was not simply Caesar's mistress or Antony's ally. She was a queen who knew 8 languages, a shrewd diplomat, a daughter of Greek blood who ruled over the land of the pharaohs. In a world of war, rebellion, and Roman ambition, Cleopatra stands alone. Amid the ruins of ancient temples, among the forgotten statues of gods, she is the last spirit to hold on to the Egyptian identity, not with swords, but with wisdom and fortitude. This is not a love story, nor is it a courtly tragedy. This is the story of a civilization's last stand against the unstoppable tide of history. You will see her, not on a throne, but in the fragments of stone blown across the desert wind. You will hear her voice, not in books, but in the early morning ibises flying over the Nile. And if you listen closely, you will understand. Cleopatra has never died. She is just waiting for someone to tell her story, this time, in truth. Sighs on the banks of the Nile. Cleopatra was not born amid the white lotuses of the Delta, nor was she descended from a mythical line of ancient pharaohs. She was born in a magnificent Greek palace in the heart of Alexandria, a city that was neither quite Egyptian nor quite Roman. A hybrid land where ancient wisdom and imperial ambition mingled in the scent of frankincense and the dust of library books. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was a king more interested in music and art than politics, a weak monarch in troubled times. The Ptolemies, left behind by Alexander the Great after his untimely death, were no longer the mighty conquerors of the previous century. They were clingers to their former glory, vying for the throne in incestuous marriages and intrigues as stifling as incense in the temple of Isis. Cleopatra was the third daughter of at least 6 half-siblings. And she learned from an early age that the throne was not a prize, it was a battlefield. She had no right to claim the succession, only to claim it, like a tigress guarding her territory in the desert. But she did not choose the sword. She chose words. Unlike her sisters, Cleopatra learned Egyptian, the language of the people that Greek kings had refused to speak for centuries. She learned Syriac, Ethiopian, Arabic, and even Latin, the language of the people who would threaten them all. Her teachers were scholars from the Library of Alexandria, men who read ancient texts from Sumer to India, men who had seen the decline of an empire and whispered to her of its impending doom. At 12, she knew how to negotiate between factions at court. At 14, she knew the tax system and the famines of the regions. When her father was deposed by rebellion and had to flee to Rome for help, Cleopatra was the only one who sent him away with a silent pact, a promise to restore his throne, even if it cost her her life. And she kept her word. When Ptolemy XII returned with Roman help, he crushed the rebels and restored the throne. Cleopatra, then about 15 years old, was seen by her father in a different light, no longer as a daughter, but as a worthy successor. But the Egyptian throne was not passed by trust. It was passed by decree and incestuous marriage. Before his death, Ptolemy XII left a will that required Cleopatra to rule jointly with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, a child of only 10. Cleopatra was not afraid of a child, but she was afraid of the men behind it. The inner court was filled with Roman advisors, hypocritical priests, and generals with their own dreams. Alexandria was no longer a city of knowledge, it was a chessboard of living pieces. Cleopatra reigned for 3 years, and at the age of 21 was dethroned by the very regents who had stood behind Ptolemy XIII. She was driven from her palace and forced to flee across the desert to Syria, Without her soldiers, without her treasures, only the memory of a once glorious empire. Amid the hot sands and dry winds of the desert, she rebuilt her camp, calling on the loyalty of her old warriors, the marginalized nobles. And she thought of Rome. There was no other way. Egypt was sinking, and if she was to rise again, she had to grasp her last anchor, Julius Caesar. The young queen and the exile. Cleopatra, when she was dethroned, did not cry, did not beg, did not shed a tear before the people chanting the name of Ptolemy XIII in the great hall of Alexandria. She walked, head held high, eyes cold, like someone who had known that day would come. But no one saw her clenched hands under her silken robes. No one heard the oath she whispered to Isis that night, "If the throne does not choose me, I will make it bow." She escaped from the palace through an ancient tunnel that led directly to the eastern harbor, where old Greek ships still swayed in the morning mist. She was only 21. No guards. No treasure. Just a few loyal men and a sword hidden under her cloak. The road to Syria was not for princesses. It was for exiles. Through deserts, through forgotten valleys, she walked with tangled hair and bleeding heels. But it was on bitterly cold nights, by the flickering fire in her makeshift tent, that she learned what it was like to be a king. No throne, no court, only true loyalty and a map drawn by her own hands. Cleopatra set up camp at Pelusium, near Egypt's eastern border, which had been a military outpost against the Assyrians. From there, she sent letters to the Bedouin tribes, to the merchants she had protected during her reign. The letters were handwritten, the ink still smudged, the words as sharp as a sword's blow. Cleopatra is still alive. And Egypt is not finished. She knew she couldn't fight Rome, not yet, at least. But what if she could get Rome on her side? What if she could get a man with a legend on his shoulders to bow to her? His name was Julius Caesar. In Rome, Caesar had defeated Pompey, becoming supreme after a civil war. When Pompey was murdered by the court of Ptolemy XIII in an attempt to curry favor with Caesar, he was furious. This was her chance, for a wise queen knows that sometimes it doesn't take blood, it just takes a carpet. Cleopatra ordered her faithful servant Apollodorus to secretly bring her into the palace of Alexandria, rolled up in a thick Persian carpet, a gift for Caesar. In the middle of the night, when the carpet was opened, Caesar, already in his 50s, with gray hair and a face marked by battle, saw a girl with dark hair, dressed in thin silk, with eyes as deep as the Nile. And history turned. She did not cry, she did not beg. She spoke to him of politics, of destiny, of the future of two empires. Caesar, a warrior from the West, had never seen a woman like her. He did not see a concubine. He saw an ally, someone who understood the world in a way he had never thought possible. Within days, Cleopatra was restored to her throne. A brief war between factions loyal to Ptolemy XIII ended with the boy's body floating down the river. Alexandria was drenched in blood, but the throne was hers. Not by her army, but by her wits and a roll of carpet. And thus the legends began. Caesar and the Carpet of Fate. The story of Cleopatra being presented to Caesar in a tapestry is more than a legend. It is a masterpiece of diplomatic wit and impeccable drama. And if fate had indeed wrapped her in that thick Persian cloth, it was Caesar who unwrapped it, never to let it go again. Julius Caesar did not come to Egypt in search of love. He came to punish the man who had murdered Pompey, a man who had been an ally, a rival, and ultimately a loser in the Roman Civil War. When Caesar saw Pompey's decapitated body, presented as a trophy by Ptolemy XIII, he was not happy. He was angry. To him, it was a barbaric, treacherous act, not the act of a civilization worthy of survival. And in that anger, a woman entered. Cleopatra was not beautiful in the Roman sense. She did not have the figure of a Venus, nor the beauty that brought down Troy. But she had something else, a mind that sparkled like a knife, a tongue like honey, and eyes that could make a weary old general forget his campaigns in the West. She spoke to Caesar in Latin, a language he did not expect to hear from an Eastern queen. She did not beg, she did not weep. She explained of her father's will, of her betrayal, of her joint rule, of the plots to kill her in the night, and of Egypt's future, if he chose the right side. Caesar, who had read hundreds of apologists in Roman politics, was now convinced by one voice. And he decreed, Cleopatra would be restored to her throne. The order struck like a hammer in the great hall of Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII was enraged, and civil war broke out in the heart of the city. Caesar's army, though small, was trained and fierce. Cleopatra, meanwhile, did not hide. She rode a white horse through the streets, distributing money and food to the people, calling for loyalty. The battle lasted for weeks, and ended with the image of Ptolemy XIII's body floating down the Nile, still clutching a broken sword. Cleopatra entered the temple of Isis, not to celebrate, but to give thanks. She knew that her regaining of the throne was not the final victory, but only the first chapter of a longer tragedy. For the next few weeks, Caesar stayed in the royal palace, and the Nile flood came earlier than ever before. Under the pale purple moonlight, he and she would stand by the window watching the river rise, talking of the world, of the empire, and of their unborn children. Then she became pregnant. The child was named Caesarin, son of Caesar. The world did not know. But fate smiled, because from now on, Rome and Egypt were no longer two separate empires. They were linked together, through a woman and a man. Dream of a resurrected empire. Cleopatra returned to the throne not with a crown, but with a vision. Egypt, she thought, could not be a pawn forever between foreign powers. If she was to surrender her soul to Rome, it would be in exchange for something greater, the rebirth of an Eastern empire where knowledge, religion, and civilization could stand on equal footing with force. After her reign was settled, Cleopatra began to reform. She abolished unjust taxes, reopened the granaries, and personally appeared in famine-stricken regions to distribute grain. Unlike her predecessors who kept their distance from the people, she appeared as a living god, not to demand sacrifices, but to offer hope. Cleopatra did not forget the value of symbolism. She saw herself as the embodiment of the goddess Isis, wearing a double crown, a combination of the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt, as a declaration of reunification of the fractured nation. Meanwhile, Caesar returned to Rome to consolidate his power. But the rumor spread faster than a horse, that the Egyptian queen had given birth to a Roman child, Caesar. This was a profound threat to the Roman Republic, where the concentration of power in one family was the greatest fear. And Cleopatra, like an oriental ghost, suddenly became the symbol of every Roman fear that she dared not name. She brought her child to Rome in 46 BC. The whole city was shocked. For the first time, the Roman people saw a queen wearing a snake crown, dressed in white silk, descending from a golden palanquin to the music of Egypt. Caesar did not hide her. He built her a private house in Rome, near his own. He also erected a statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the place where the ancestor of the Caesar family was worshipped. That was enough to make his political enemies act. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Forum, by the very men who had once called him the father of the nation. When the last blade was pulled from his back, Cleopatra's world collapsed. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Forum, by the very men who had once called him the father of the nation. When the last blade was pulled from his back, Cleopatra's world collapsed. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra mourned for 70 days, as was the custom in ancient Egypt. She shaved her head, dressed in coarse linen, and walked barefoot into the temple of Isis each night. The people no longer called her the foreign queen. She was now the mother of Egypt. And in that morning, she nurtured a new dream. Caesarion would succeed Caesar, unite Rome and Egypt, and become emperor of a new world, where East and West would no longer fight each other, but stand together in the sunlight. Marc Antony, the general and his lover. After Caesar's death, Rome fell into chaos. Those who had cheered the death of a dictator began to tremble at the swords of the loyalists. The empire split into three: Octavian, Caesar's adopted nephew, Lepidus, the quiet one who waited for his chance, and Marc Antony, the general, his close friend, the one who held the blood letter and hunted down the traitors. Cleopatra followed every news from Alexandria. She sent no condolences, no letters of marriage. She waited. For a man like Antony would bow to no one. A man like Antony had to be convinced by splendor. 3 years later, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, a city in southern Asia Minor. But she did not come as a petitioner. She came as a god. She boarded a ship, not a warship, but a gilded ship with purple silk sails and silver oars. On deck, she lay under a jeweled canopy, fanned with peacock feathers, holding a cup of wine. Priestesses surrounded her as Aphrodite's maidens. Wherever the ship sailed, people poured out onto the riverbanks as if they were witnessing a miracle. Antony, hearing the story, laughed loudly, "So she plays the goddess." But when he got closer to the ship, he stopped laughing. Cleopatra stepped down, not bowing, not kneeling. She simply said, "If you are Mars, the god of war, then I am Venus, and I have come not to conquer, but to unite." From that day on, they were inseparable. Marc Antony was a man of war, rough, hot-tempered, a wine drinker, blindly loyal. But he also had the soul of a poet, a vulnerable heart, and a void left by Caesar's death. Cleopatra stepped into that void like water into a cup, just right, gentle, and irresistibly so. They lived together in Alexandria, not as king and queen, but as two people coming into their own for the first time. Antony dressed in Egyptian cloth, hunted and fished with her, and attended the Isis festival like commoners. The people called them the divine couple. And indeed, in the Alexandrian twilight, they looked more like gods than men. Cleopatra bore Antony 2 sons and a daughter, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. A mixed family, Roman and Egyptian, grew up amid music and incense, among libraries and warriors. But love, if too bright, will blind those who crave power. In Rome, Octavian hated Cleopatra. She was a threat to him, not just because of her power, but because of the unspoken truth that she had driven 2 of Rome's greatest men to abandon Rome for her sake. Cleopatra need not fear. She had Antony, and the dream of the East was resurrected, this time, not just with Caesarion, but with a new dynasty. A new Rome, in the shape of Alexandria. 2 anticipants of the empire. After the love between Cleopatra and Marc Antony blossomed, the world could no longer stand still. Because this was not just a matter of 2 hearts, it was the union of 2 forces. And every kiss they shared made Rome tremble. Marc Antony divided the eastern part of Rome between Cleopatra and her children. He made no secret of it. He called Cleopatra Queen of Kings, Alexander Helios King of Armenia, Ptolemy Philadelphus King of Syria and Asia Minor, and Caesarion, Caesar's son, King of Kings. In Alexandria, a grand ceremony was held, where Cleopatra and Antony sat on a double throne, hand in hand, watching the 3 children being crowned with small crowns. In the square, people threw flowers and burned incense, but from the west, the wind began to blow the smell of gunpowder and intrigue. In Rome, Octavian held the proclamation of Alexandria in his hand, shaking not with fear, but with anger. Cleopatra, a foreign woman, had dared to redistribute the world map, as if Rome were just a chapter in her book. He spread rumors throughout the city, that Antony had been bewitched, that he had renounced Rome, and given his sword and laurel wreath to an Egyptian sorceress. And while the Romans feared that Cleopatra would rule from the east, Octavian declared war, not against Antony, but against the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra did not back down. She built more ships, recruited soldiers, fortified the supply lines, and swore an oath under the statue of Isis, declaring that she would defend Egypt's sovereignty to her last breath. No one called her a lover anymore. She was now a commander. Antony, retreating from Syria, divided the army into two, one part under his command, the other under Cleopatra. During the parades, she wore armor, rode with the generals, her eyes no longer those of someone waiting for love, but of someone ready to face fate. On the plains near Ephesus, the armies of the east gathered: Egyptians, Armenians, Cilicians, and even Arab warriors. Antony, as the queen's son-in-law, became the center of an unprecedented alliance. And Octavian? He needed no alliances. He had Rome. He brought with him veteran troops, trained by the bloody battles of Gaul, Iberia, and Germania. He brought fear and hatred, weapons uncharted, but more powerful than any spear. In the summer of 31 BC, the two sides met at sea, in the Gulf of Actium. Cleopatra proposed a sea battle, since her fleet was larger, and she believed that the waves would cover her weaknesses on land. Antony agreed, a decision that would later be called a mistake. The two of them were on the same ship, strategizing day and night. On the last night before the battle, they sat silently together, not speaking. Cleopatra placed her hand on Antony's heart and whispered, "If I lose tomorrow, let me lose like a king." He replied, "If I win, let me rule like a goddess." Dawn dyes the Actium sea red. The horn sounds like a cry from the past. The battle begins. At first, Cleopatra's ships held the advantage. But Octavian had another weapon, Agrippa, a master of naval tactics. The smaller, more agile Roman ships retreated to lure their opponents into a corner, then suddenly counterattacked. The wind shifted, smoke rose, and blood stained the waves. When Cleopatra saw defeat approaching, she decided to retreat to save her own. She gave the order to retreat to Egypt, and her ships turned to leave the bay. Antony, in the midst of the chaos, saw her ship drifting away. He did not hesitate. Leaving the battlefield, he took his small boat in pursuit, not for the sake of honor, but for the sake of his heart. The Battle of Actium was over. Defeated, but not by weapons, but by love. Cities that bowed: Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. After the defeat at Actium, the world thought Cleopatra and Antony would fall. But no, they returned to Egypt, not as two defeated men, but as two ghosts carrying the flame of an empire that had not yet been extinguished. Alexandria locked its gates, temples continued to perform rituals, and merchant ships sailed into port as if nothing had happened. But in Antony's eyes, darkness began to creep in. He was no longer the legendary general, but a man with an unhealed wound, a wound in his pride. He looked at himself in the bronze mirror, saw gray hair, trembling hands, and a crumbling empire behind the woman he loved. Cleopatra saw it, and she did not blame him, because she understood the loss of glory leaves a void more dangerous than any spear. And to soothe that wound, Cleopatra took him to the east, where the glory had not yet faded: Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, three cities that were the soul of the Persian Empire, once the counterweight to the entire Western world. She wanted him to see that greatness was not only in Rome. Babylon welcomed them with the sun-drenched ziggurat, with the hanging gardens that remained like a fairy tale dream. People poured out on both sides of the road, strewing flowers and burning incense. No one called them losers. Here, they were gods returning. At Susa, they held a festival in the white stone square, where Cleopatra appeared in pale purple, her hair braided with gold thread, and Antony in Persian dress and an emerald crown. Under the light of oil lamps, they danced as if the war had never happened. Antony smiled again, for the first time since Actium. And in that moment, Cleopatra knew she had not lost him. Not completely. But it was not Antony's eyes that worried her, but the letters from Alexandria. News from Rome was pouring in. Octavian was advancing, not quickly, but surely. He was conquering country by country, army by army, port by port. He did not want a quick victory, he wanted a slow strangulation. At Persepolis, they visited the old temple of Darius. There were only rubble and collapsed columns, but when Cleopatra placed her hand on the cuneiform inscriptions, she said, "All empires believe themselves to be immortal, but only myths live on." Antony turned to her and asked, "So are we empires or myths?" Cleopatra smiled sadly, "We are what they will write when everything is over." That night, the two of them held each other in the cold stone corridor, without saying a word. And when the sun rose, they set off back to Egypt, this time, not to hide, but to prepare for the end. The last days in Alexandria. Alexandria, the shining capital of the East, the city of sun temples, vast libraries and white stone streets, was now enveloped in an unusual silence. The news of Octavian's march along the Nile had reached every market corner, every roof. The people did not flee, did not revolt. They were simply silent, as if the whole city were holding its breath, waiting for the final storm. Cleopatra stood on the watchtower by the eastern gate, her hair blowing in the wind, her hands resting lightly on the cold stone wall. Below, Egyptian soldiers were training, but their eyes were dull. She knew this was not an army of men who believed in victory. These were men prepared to die for something greater. In the palace, Antony no longer went to war. He locked himself in his study, drinking wine every night. His old friends left, his allies surrendered one by one. He had only one thing left, love. Cleopatra came to him every night. She said nothing, just sat quietly. Once he turned to her and asked, "Are you afraid?" She smiled, "Afraid of having nothing left to protect. And death, I have become accustomed to it since I became a queen." Octavian sent a letter. He did not ask for surrender. He asked for her. Cleopatra was invited to negotiate. Alone. She came, without crown, without attendants, dressed only in black, her head covered with a silk scarf. She did not kneel. She sat down opposite the man who would swallow her kingdom. And she said, "If you need the throne, I will give it to you. But if you need blood, spill my blood, not the blood of Alexandria." Octavian did not answer. He just looked at her for a long time, then withdrew from the room. That night, Antony heard that she might betray him. His heart, already broken, broke. He did not ask her. He did not need to. The next morning, he drew his sword and stabbed himself in the stomach on the roof of the palace. His blood fell on the white stone floor, spreading like a red tide. Cleopatra ran to him, screaming in despair. But he was still breathing enough for her to hold him, tears falling down his cheeks, and he whispered, "She was never a traitor. I was just not strong enough to keep her." He died in her arms. Alexandria doesn't sing anymore. Death of a queen. Alexandria did not fall to Roman blood, but in mourning. When Antony died, the city seemed to be buried under a colorless fog. There was no more music, no more drums, no more festivals. There was only the quiet sound of footsteps, the crackling of candles in the temples, and the sighs of a people who knew their era was coming to an end. Cleopatra locked herself in the western tower of the palace, the highest room overlooking the harbor where Roman ships were slowly approaching. She did not eat, did not speak, wore only white, and meditated every day before the statue of the goddess Isis. She still had 3 young children, Helios, Selene, and Philadelphus. They innocently asked, "Mother, where are we going?" She stroked their hair and whispered, "Into the legend." Octavian entered Alexandria a victor who needed no applause. He did not gloat, nor did he resent. He did only one thing. He ordered Cleopatra captured to be taken to Rome as a living trophy. But the queen was no gift to be displayed. Cleopatra knew her time had come. She wrote to Octavian, asking to be buried beside Antony, asking for nothing more. When the soldiers arrived, they knocked on the tower door, but it was too late. She was dead. On the stone floor was her body lying on its side, wearing a white dress, light makeup, a gold snake bracelet on her wrist. No wounds. No struggle. Only her lips were closed as if whispering a final spell. It is said that she used a poisonous snake asp, hidden in a fruit basket. When bitten, the snake left a small red mark on her left breast, right below the necklace engraved with a lotus flower. Her body was placed next to Antony's, as he had wished. 2 people, 2 worlds, 2 tragedies, now lying side by side as if the war had never happened. Octavian stood outside, looking at the 2 coffins, and said, "She did not lose. She just chose to end." And so, Egypt, the civilization that had ruled the world for 3,000 years, ended not with fire, but with silence. Not with a sword, but with the gaze of a woman who finally knew when to bow her head. Heritage without map. After Cleopatra's death, Rome had no rivals in the East. Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. But in his chariot he did not bring the Egyptian queen as a trophy, nor the golden statue of her kneeling. He only brought 3 children, the children of Cleopatra and Antony, whom he later separated and sent to the Roman noble families as odd gifts from fate. Caesar, son of Cleopatra and Caesar, was quietly murdered as soon as he set foot on shore. No trial, no reason, just a cold sentence from Octavian, "There shall be only one Caesar." And so the world turned. Rome became an empire, Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Historians began to rewrite the story, turning Cleopatra into a sorceress, a slut, a woman who used her body to manipulate great men. They forgot she spoke 8 languages. They forgot she saved her people from starvation. They forgot she dared to challenge an empire, not with her army, but with her will. But that's history. It's always told by the victors. Alexandria survived for a while. The library burned down, piece by piece, year by year. Statues were chiseled away. Portraits of Cleopatra were replaced with mocking drawings. But there was one thing Rome could not take away: her name. Cleopatra. The name has endured for thousands of years, in paintings, in plays, in music, in the dreams of little girls who stood before their mirrors and imagined themselves queens. And it is a legacy without a map. Cleopatra left no territory, no castles, no great walls. But she left the idea that a woman, even in the world of men, can decide her own destiny. Not by living long, but by dying at the right time. And so, in the Egyptian desert wind, one can still hear the whisper. If you cannot be a queen in the world of empires, then be a goddess in the memory of humanity.